I wanted to ask about your profile of Kobe via Jellybean Bryant, and I was sort of surprised when I read it of what a loving and almost passive character he was. I only knew sort of tangentially about their rough relationship. Was that a surprise to you?
Yeah, I think I had this vague recollection of him as a player. I'm 38, so I had this sort of sense of Jellybean, and then I had the same recollection of during Kobe's first few years in LA, where Jellybean was already always there, and then the split with Vanessa, which is really weird. But I didn't expect him to be this goofy. He's just sort of a goofy guy, very wary. But also someone who, if you were to just go up to him, he's going to high five you or slap you on the back, and he's one of those, like, almost a salesman's attitude sometimes.
Yeah, and also I thought that your kind of characterization of Kobe, of what he learned from him and what he didn't, and maybe in a way I think people learn from their parents, right, in what they want to be and what they don't want to be. And it seems like Kobe really picked and chose from what he saw in his dad, and from what he wanted to make himself.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit on me there, Beckley. I think you're sort of talking about the idea of what he wanted Kobe to be versus what he ended up being. And by the way, after that
Kobe's determining his own identity too, of seeing his dad and saying, okay, I want this part of his life, and maybe I want to take it this direction. He also saw things that he didn't want to be.
Yeah, yeah. I'm watching the chat here, and I had to add, after the right guard, but I love this. So he sprays right guard all over his torso, all over his torso. Then he takes out his cologne and he starts firing that all over the torso as well. So he's sort of double covered, and Diao eventually just sort of moves all the way out of the way to his left. But back to Kobe, yeah, I think Kobe always idolized his father. I don't think he ever looked at his dad and said, that's someone I shouldn't be. Maybe when he got older he thought that, but he always thought, Italy, playing pro ball in Italy, that's amazing. And whatever level his dad was at was amazing when he was a kid. And it wasn't until Kobe got a little older that he must realized on some level that his father didn't have things that he has. And maybe that's why he's so protective of him now. I was really surprised by how protective Kobe was. I would be a little bitter if my dad had, sort of basically disowned me because he didn't like who I married. But Kobe seems to be, at least publicly, just, I'm going to stand behind him.
Yeah, it was a great profile. Well, I want to hop back to Duncan, and one thing you touched on was Duncan is sort of a coach, and how Pop will walk away from the huddle, and Duncan and Parker will basically do all the coaching, and then they'll come back and be like, okay, ready, break. And on that shot, he hit the big three in Game 1 against Phoenix. Duncan basically drew up that play. If you watch the replay, Popovich wanders around the court and then comes back and they go out and run this great play. Do you think Duncan's size, being a big man and being so sort of expressionless, hides what a cerebral player he is? And, whereas Kevin Garnett's always yelling and talking, and we just think of him as a leader in that way?
I was curious about this. One of the things I asked people, I asked Pop, Duncan, Budenholzer, Kerr, and I think Ferry, and I said, could Duncan coach the team right now, player coach? Could you just say, play tomorrow night, Duncan, you do it? And the answers varied, and essentially they said yes, because the system is so set in place now. Duncan could coach the game. He couldn't coach practice because apparently he's not very good with organization. So they said if he ends up being a coach, he wouldn't be a guy to make your head coach. He'd be like the player personnel guy, perhaps. But they thought in a game he knows the system well enough. He knows who should play where, and people listen to him. So I think he's cerebral in that sense. Another thing is that apparently Pop has really impacted the way that Duncan sees the world. So Pop talked about politics a lot over the last 15 years, and he's always forcing these guys to listen to him. Apparently he railed about Bush and Cheney and all those guys and Rumsfeld, and they'd be like, who's Rumsfeld, And then Pop would go on like a 20-minute answer about it. But so he's gotten a lot of that from them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Duncan would have any interest in coaching?
He said he might. He wasn't sure. Pop basically, I think the exact thing he said is Tim is too good a guy and has too much going for him to spend his life dealing with assholes. That was Pop's take on it. He didn't think he would. Duncan said, I know enough guys in the league that I could go a lot of places. He'd go Oklahoma City because of Presti. He could go wherever Kerr ends up if he ends up somewhere else. Mike Brown. He'd go to any of these guys and get a job, so he knows it'll be there. Whether he does it, doesn't know.
Right. Well, speaking of dealing with assholes all the time, that used to be something Popovich really didn't want to do, was deal with rookies, put them on the court, develop them, give them these opportunities. From what I've heard, he's really sort of changed his, I wouldn't say it was an epiphany, but changed his outlook on rookies and young players and development. Do you get that sense hanging out with the team?
I think a little. I think he's embraced it a little more. I think one thing that Ethan and I were talking about earlier, this closed sense of the Spurs, is people think of Pop as a disciplinarian to a certain extent, but I don't think they realize just how profane he is. He gets on these guys like you wouldn't believe. He's after him in practice, just motherfucker this, motherfucker that, and those young guys come in and immediately they have to decide, okay, can I take this or can I not? And it sort of works out pretty quickly one way or the other. But I think what he's done is allowed Duncan and to a certain extent Ginobili and Parker to handle some of the younger guys. It used to be Pop had to keep everyone in line. Now
Sure.
He can let them do a little bit of that, perhaps with a little less obscenity.
Well, where does Steven Jackson fit into that?
Oh, yeah, well, those Jackson stories were great. I could have talked to people about Jackson forever. And Malik Rose told it was like a 10-minute version of what I have in the story of how Jackson would get Pop would motion for him to come out of the game, and he'd wander around this way, and then he'd swear over here, and he'd swear over here, and he'd get back down on the bench, and Mike Brown would be 2 seats down from Pop, and Jackson, Pop would say, just tell me when you're ready to come back in. And Jackson would turn to Mike Brown eventually when he calmed down a little bit, and he'd say, okay, I'm ready to go back in. And Brown would say, hey, coach, he's ready to go back in. And Pop would say, no, he's got to tell me. So he'd force Steven Jackson to walk down the bench, come over, coach, I'm ready to go back in. He's like, okay, you can go back in now. And so, he had like 20 stories like this about Jackson, who's a really lovable guy, I'm sure, as Ethan knows, but is quite volatile.
Well, how does Popovich, what is it about his personality that allows him to do this sort of stuff without turning players off? Is it his cachet with guys like Duncan that really pulls him through? Or, why doesn't everyone just think he's an asshole?
Because everything he does other than coaching is great. Budenholzer says that Pop's great skill is not strategy, it's actually the camaraderie. So his ability to bond with players is, people say this is his best skill. He's got this dry humor, he's got the wit, and he's always behind him. He's never going to the media and killing one of his guys in the media. He's always got their back. So he'll be hard on them in practice and maybe in the games, but the rest of the time they know that he's got the support of them.
Sure, and that's got to be extremely powerful in a business where, especially if you're a role player and he's asking you to do things, like just play defense and shoot threes, where, you're playing for your next contract, and to know that someone's not going to blow that for you is probably very powerful for some of the fringe players. Did you get any sense of what Diaw is like on that team? And he seems to be such a great addition to them.
Yeah, that's one of those signings that when you saw it happen, you're like, this guy is suddenly going to become decent again, right? And I didn't spend enough time around him just to see what he's like there, but clearly I think having Parker makes a big difference. Being able to have someone who understands him, he's perfect for that kind of system. I don't know if he's riding his Segway around San Antonio or not, but I hope he is.